He was never meant to go down in history. For 40 years of his life, Oliver Cromwell was an utterly unremarkable man, a shadow against the backdrop of his era's tumultuous events. He was born in the year 1599 into the family of a country nobleman, or as they were called in England, the gentry. His family had once been wealthy and influential. His great-great-grandfather had been a confidant of King Henry VI and had made a fortune during the dissolution of the monasteries. But by the time of Oliver's birth, only the memory of its former greatness remained. He was, in essence, a prosperous farmer, a gentleman from the deep countryside. His world was confined to the fields of Huntingdon, the local church, and family concerns. Nothing, absolutely nothing in his early biography pointed to the future regicide and dictator. He received the typical education for his class, attending the local school and then spending 1 year at Cambridge. He was not a brilliant student, showing more interest in sports like wrestling, swimming, and riding than in Latin and theology. He was a robust, physically strong young man with a stern, somewhat coarse face, which, as contemporaries reported, featured a large wart. He was hot-tempered, prone to fits of melancholy, and, like many in that age, deeply, almost fanatically religious. He was a Puritan. Puritanism was not just a religious movement, it was a worldview. The Puritans, followers of John Calvin's teachings, believed in divine predestination. They held that God had chosen certain people, the elect, for salvation in advance, and others for eternal damnation. And although no one could know for certain which category they belonged to, the elect were expected to prove their status through their entire lives, through hard work, strict morality, modesty, constant Bible reading, and prayer. They despised the papal pomp of the official Anglican Church, its hierarchy of bishops, and its rituals, which they believed were borrowed from the Catholics. They wanted to purify the Church, to make it simple and austere, based solely on the Word of God. For Cromwell, this faith was not just a set of rules, it was the essence of his life. He sincerely believed that his every step, his every action, was visible to God, and that he, Oliver Cromwell, was an instrument in the hands of Providence. It is precisely these stories of how unassuming, modest people step out of the shadows at history's turning points and change the world that fascinate us most. They show that true greatness is not always a matter of lineage, but of character and faith when faced with the ultimate challenges. Our channel, Personalities in Detail, is dedicated to such complex, controversial figures whose actions inspire both admiration and horror. To ensure you don't miss any of our deep dives into the most dramatic biographies, subscribe to the channel now, leave a like, and hit the notification bell. And now, back to England, where tensions are about to boil over. After his father's death, he was forced to drop out of his studies and return home to manage the modest estate and care for his mother and sisters. He married and had children, leading the life of an ordinary provincial squire, farming the land, engaging in local affairs, and handling minor legal matters. Around the age of 30, he experienced a profound spiritual crisis, a rebirth, as he called it. He was on the verge of despair, tormented by thoughts of his sins and his potential damnation. Yet, after this crisis, his faith became even stronger, verging on unshakable. He became one of the most respected Puritans in his county. In the year 1628, he was elected to Parliament for the first time. He was an unremarkable member from Huntingdon, delivering only a single but very passionate speech in defense of persecuted Puritan preachers. Soon after, however, King Charles I, clashing with Parliament's defiance, dissolved it and began his 11-year period of personal rule. For Cromwell, as for many others, this was a time of despair. He even considered emigrating to America, to New England, where Puritans were trying to build their kingdom of God on earth. But he stayed. He continued his quiet, inconspicuous life, managing his estate and praying. It seemed as though history would pass him by, but history was just preparing to make its move. King Charles I was a man who seemed born to lose his throne. He was stubborn, arrogant, and, like his father, held a sacred belief in the divine right of kings. He believed his power was granted by God and that he was accountable to no one, least of all to a parliament. He introduced new taxes without Parliament's consent, persecuted the Puritans, and tried to impose a uniform Anglican rite, close to Catholicism, on the entire country. He ruled like an absolute monarch, and the gulf between him and his people, especially the Puritan segment, grew ever deeper. The spark that ignited the flame came from Scotland. When Charles tried to impose an Anglican prayer book on the Scottish Presbyterians, they rebelled. This began the so-called Bishops' Wars. To raise money for the war against the Scots, Charles was forced, after an 11-year hiatus, to convene Parliament once again. This happened in the year 1640, and among the members who flocked to London was the 40-year-old Oliver Cromwell, now representing Cambridge. He was no longer the timid newcomer of a decade prior. He was a mature man, firmly grounded, with a reputation as an honest and pious man, a defender of the common people. Another member described his first impression of Cromwell thus, quote, "The new Parliament, which would go down in history as the Long Parliament, had no intention of giving the king money. Instead, it began to present its own demands, punishing hated royal ministers, abolishing illegal taxes, and guaranteeing that Parliament would be convened regularly. The confrontation between the king and Parliament intensified. Cromwell, though not yet a leader, became one of the most active and radical members of the opposition. He did not speak often, but his speeches, devoid of any elegance, were filled with biblical fury and righteous anger. He saw the political struggle not merely as a dispute over taxes and power, but as a great spiritual battle, a fight between the forces of piety, represented by the God-fearing Parliament, and the forces of popery and tyranny, embodied by the king and his circle. The escalation climaxed in January of 1642. Charles decided to crush the opposition with a single blow and appeared in person with a troop of soldiers in the House of Commons to arrest 5 of its leaders. However, they had been warned and managed to escape. This act of unprecedented violence, the king's armed intrusion into the inner sanctum of Parliament, was the straw that broke the camel's back. London rose up. The king was forced to flee the capital for the north. Both sides began to raise armies. In August of 1642, King Charles I raised his standard in Nottingham. The English Civil War had begun, and Oliver Cromwell, a 43-year-old farmer who had never served a single day in the military, returned to his home in Cambridge to raise a cavalry unit for the parliamentary army with his own money and that of his supporters. The unremarkable man was stepping out of the shadows, and very soon he would show all of England how a true soldier of God must fight and win. When the war began, the Parliament's army presented a pathetic sight. It consisted of hastily assembled troops from local militias, city guards, and mercenaries, commanded by aristocrats like the Earl of Essex or the Earl of Manchester. These men were brave, but they were amateurs. They fought in a gentlemanly fashion, avoiding decisive battles and sending their soldiers home after each campaign. Their opponents, the Cavaliers, the King's army, were their equals, but possessed a crucial advantage: a brilliant cavalry composed of high-born cavaliers who had learned to wield a sword and ride from childhood. At the head of this cavalry was the king's nephew, the charismatic and daring Prince Rupert of the Rhine. In the war's early battles, such as the Battle of Edgehill, the outcome was always the same. The parliamentary infantry held its ground, but its cavalry was routed by the furious charge of the Cavaliers, who would then get carried away with chasing and plundering the baggage train, losing their formation, and thereby forfeiting the ultimate victory. Oliver Cromwell, who at the war's start was merely the captain of a small cavalry unit of 60 men, watched this with growing anger and disappointment. With his pragmatic farmer's mind, he immediately recognized the root of the problem. He was not a strategist. He was a brilliant organizer and psychologist. After the Battle of Edgehill, he spoke words to his cousin John Hampden, one of Parliament's leaders, that would become the key to his future victories. "Your troops are composed for the most part of old, worn-out servants, bartenders, and similar rabble. And their troops are the sons of noblemen and fine gentlemen. Do you seriously believe that the souls of such base and common fellows can ever compete with men who possess honor, courage, and resolve?" Cromwell understood that to counter the aristocratic honor of the Cavaliers, something greater than a mercenary's pay was needed. He continued, he decided to create a new type of army, one whose main strength would be not lineage, but ideology. An army that would fight not for money or for lords, but for God and the just cause of Parliament. He returned to East Anglia, the land of the Puritans, and began to recruit his own soldiers. He did not take just anyone. He selected the men personally, paying attention not to their social status, but to their character and, above all, their religious zeal. He recruited landowners, free farmers, property holders, artisans, and small merchants. They were sober, hard-working, God-fearing men who could read the Bible for themselves and who went to war not for adventure, but out of deep conviction. He told them, quote, he established iron discipline for his soldiers, but this discipline was based not on fear of punishment, but on the idea. His camp was not like a gathering of mercenaries, but a religious community. Drunkenness, gambling, and swearing were ruthlessly punished. Every day began and ended with a communal prayer and the singing of psalms. Before every battle, they prayed. At the same time, Cromwell was astonishingly tolerant for his time. He did not care which Protestant sect a soldier belonged to, whether he was a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or, like himself, an independent. The most important thing was one: faith in God and hatred for the papists and tyranny. Quote 6, he said. Quote 7, he not only prayed with his soldiers, he molded them into the most effective cavalrymen in Europe. He armed them with heavy pistols and broadswords and clad them in simple but sturdy cuirasses, which is why they were later called. Quote 8, he taught them new tactics, unlike Prince Rupert's cavalry, which scattered to plunder after the first charge. Cromwell hammered the most important rule into his soldiers. After the charge, immediately restore formation, regroup, and deliver a new blow to the enemy's weak point. His cavalry was not a wolf pack, but a battering ram that struck at one point, broke through the defense, returned, and struck again. Very soon, this new army, forged from faith and discipline, showed what it could do. Cromwell's unit, which quickly grew into a full regiment, began to win one victory after another in the small skirmishes in East Anglia. His Ironsides knew no defeat. They fought with the fury of Old Testament warriors, charging into attack while singing psalms, their battle cry being, "The Lord of Hosts!" Rumors of this strange, invincible colonel and his praying soldiers spread throughout England. The finest hour for Cromwell and his Ironsides came on the 2nd of July, 1644, at the Battle of Marston Moor in Yorkshire. It was the largest and bloodiest battle of the entire war. The combined army of Parliament and their Scottish allies, numbering about 28,000 men, faced an 18,000-strong Royalist army under the command of Prince Rupert. Cromwell, by then a lieutenant general, commanded the cavalry on the left wing of the parliamentary army. The battle began in the evening after a long day of waiting, set against the backdrop of a gathering thunderstorm. As usual, Prince Rupert was the first to attack. His cavaliers launched their famous, impetuous charge against the right wing of the parliamentarian army. Lord Fairfax's cavalry was overwhelmed and routed. In the center, the Royalist infantry also began to push back Parliament's regiments. It seemed as if the battle was lost. The right wing and center of the parliamentarian army were shattered and fleeing in panic. The parliamentarian commanders, Lords Fairfax, Leven, and Manchester, left the battlefield, certain of a total defeat. But on the left wing, something entirely different was happening. There stood Cromwell with his Ironsides. He intercepted the attack of the opposing Royalist cavalry and, after a fierce battle, threw them back. Cromwell himself was slightly wounded in the neck, but did not leave his formation. And it was here that he did what Prince Rupert never had. Instead of getting carried away in pursuit of the beaten enemy, he immediately halted his soldiers, reformed them, and after assessing the situation on the battlefield, executed a brilliant maneuver. He turned his entire cavalry, rode across the battlefield, and fell upon the rear of Prince Rupert's victorious cavalry, which by that time had broken formation and was plundering Parliament's baggage train. This was a shock. Rupert's cavaliers, attacked from an unexpected direction, were taken completely by surprise and decisively crushed. Now, Cromwell was the master of the battlefield. He reformed his cavalry once more and charged into the rear and flank of the Royalist infantry, which was still pushing back the remnants of the parliamentarian troops in the center. Trapped between their own infantry and Cromwell's Ironsides, the king's army was doomed. The battle turned into a slaughter that lasted late into the night. By morning, the entire royal army in the north of England had ceased to exist. Prince Rupert, returning to the battlefield, asked one of the prisoners in astonishment who had destroyed his cavalry, and he heard a new, fearsome nickname. The prisoner replied, referring to Cromwell himself. This nickname, given to him by Rupert out of respect for his unshakable resolve, stuck with him and his soldiers forever. Marston Moor was the turning point of the war. The north of England was lost to the king, and the entire country learned that Parliament had a new, true leader. Not an aristocrat or a courtier, but a stern, God-fearing farmer from Huntingdon who could not only pray, but also win. But Cromwell did not bask in glory. He was seething with anger. He saw that the victory at Marston Moor had not been decisively exploited. His direct superior, the Earl of Manchester, commander of the Army of the Eastern Association, acted indecisively, allowing King Charles to raise a new army. Cromwell realized that as long as Parliament's army was commanded by aristocrats who, in their hearts, did not want a total victory over their own king, this war would last forever. "If we continue to fight this way," he said, "the war will last 100 years. He returned to London, appeared in Parliament, and dealt a devastating blow to the old command. He accused the Earl of Manchester of treason and indecisiveness. "This man," he thundered, "does not want the war to end. He fears victory as much as defeat." He demanded a complete reorganization of the army. He proposed passing the Self-Denying Ordinance, a law that prohibited members of Parliament from holding command posts in the army. It was a cunning move. It removed all the noble dilettantes, like Essex and Manchester, from command. As a member of Parliament himself, he would have had to resign as well. However, his supporters ensured that an exception was made for him as an indispensable expert. And then he achieved his main goal. Parliament decided to create the new model army. It was England's first regular professional army, paid a permanent salary. It was organized on the same principles Cromwell had used to build his Ironsides. Soldiers and officers were appointed based on ability, not nobility, and the entire army was imbued with a spirit of Puritan piety. Thomas Fairfax was appointed commander-in-chief, but everyone knew who the true soul of this army was. Oliver Cromwell became lieutenant general and commander of the entire cavalry. Now he held in his hands the instrument he himself had created, a perfect, invincible war machine forged from faith and iron. And with this army, he did not just want to defeat the king. He wanted to build a new, godly world on the ruins of the old. The creation of the new model army marked the end of Old England. It was not merely a military reform, it was a social and ideological revolution. For the first time in the country's history, an army was created based not on feudal loyalty or mercenary service, but on an idea and on meritocracy, advancement by ability. Officer posts went not to high-born lords, but to talented commoners, cobblers, tinkers, and brewers. One of Cromwell's best cavalry colonels was a former drayman named John Pride. This was unheard of and scandalous in aristocratic England. Yet it was precisely what made the army invincible. Soldiers and officers were bound not just by the chains of discipline, but by a common cause and a shared faith. They were the people of God who had taken up arms. They received their baptism by fire on June 14, 1645, at the Battle of Naseby. It was the decisive battle of the First Civil War. King Charles, at the head of his last great army, clashed with the new model army under the command of Fairfax and Cromwell. The course of the battle was almost a mirror image of Marston Moor. Prince Rupert, commanding the royalist right wing, once again swept away the opposing parliamentarian cavalry with his famous charge, and he once again made his fatal mistake. Intoxicated by success, he got carried away in pursuit, charged to plunder the enemy's baggage train and was out of the battle for a long time. At the same time, on the other wing, Oliver Cromwell, at the head of his Ironsides, charged the Royalist cavalry under the command of Sir Marmaduke Langdale. The Ironsides attacked like an avalanche, singing psalms. After a fierce battle, they repelled the opposing cavalry and completely shattered them. And Cromwell, just as at Marston Moor, immediately demonstrated his brilliant tactical discipline. He left only a small contingent to pursue the beaten enemy, gathered his main forces into an iron fist, wheeled around, and fell upon the flank and rear of the Royalist infantry, which had been successfully pushing back the new model army's infantry in the center. That was the end. Attacked from three sides, the Royalist infantry was surrounded and almost completely annihilated or captured. When Prince Rupert finally returned to the battlefield from his raid, he was met with a scene of total devastation. King Charles, facing this catastrophe, wanted to personally lead his last guard in a suicidal charge. But one of his lords grabbed his horse's bridle, led him away from the battlefield, and cried, "Your Majesty, do you seek your death?" The Battle of Naseby was not just a defeat, it was a death sentence for the Royalist cause. The king's army no longer existed. More importantly, Charles's personal baggage train, containing his secret correspondence, fell into Parliament's hands. These letters were promptly published, and all of England learned with horror that their king, while negotiating with Parliament, was secretly asking the Catholic powers of Europe for aid. He even tried to hire Irish Catholics, the very people Protestants considered savages and murderers, to fight against his own people. In the eyes of many, even moderates, he transformed from a misguided monarch into a treacherous traitor. After Naseby, the war became a mere cleanup operation. The new model army methodically rolled over the last pockets of resistance like a steamroller. In the year 1646, King Charles realized that all was lost. He fled and surrendered not to Parliament, but to its Scottish allies, hoping to play them against each other. The First Civil War was over. Parliament had won. But now it faced a new, even more difficult question: what to do with the victory, and what to do with the king. At this very moment, the unity of the victors shattered. Parliament, where Presbyterians and moderate Puritans formed the majority, wanted to disband the army as quickly as possible, as it was frightened by the army's radicalism and its popular character. They wanted to reach an agreement with the king, restore him to the throne with limited powers, and establish a Presbyterian church in England on the Scottish model, with a strict hierarchy and intolerance toward other faiths. But the army saw things differently. The soldiers and officers who had shed their blood had no intention of going home without receiving their pay, which they often had to wait months for, and most importantly, without guarantees of freedom of conscience. The army consisted mainly of independents, radical Puritans who, like Cromwell, believed that every religious community should be independent and that the state had no right to impose a faith on the people. Even more radical ideas flourished within the army. The Levelers demanded universal male suffrage and the declaration of a republic. The army transformed from a tool of Parliament into an independent and formidable political force. It was the only organized and armed power in the country, and it was well aware of that fact. Cromwell was caught in the middle. He was both a member of Parliament and the second in command of the army. He tried to mediate, calling for moderation and compromise. But when Parliament, in its arrogance, not only refused to pay their wages, but also declared the soldiers enemies of the state, Cromwell made his choice. He realized that the Parliament they had fought for had betrayed them. He secretly left London, joined the army, and definitively took its side. The army responded decisively to Parliament's actions. A cavalry detachment seized the king, who was under the guard of parliamentary commissioners, and brought him to the army's headquarters. Now the most important trump card, the figure of the king, was in their hands. Following this, the entire new model army marched on London. Meeting no resistance, it entered the capital and effectively carried out a military coup. Cromwell and the army generals expelled their fiercest opponents, the Presbyterians, from Parliament. Of the once mighty Long Parliament, only a pitiful remnant remained, a rump Parliament that obeyed the will of the army. Now Cromwell and the army leadership began their own negotiations with Charles. They made him surprisingly lenient proposals, known as the heads of proposals. They were willing to restore him to the throne and preserve the House of Lords, but they demanded regular convocations of Parliament and, most importantly, guarantees of religious tolerance. This was their highest ideal, but Charles, even as a prisoner, could not accept defeat. He was a master of double-dealing. While pretending to negotiate with the army, he was simultaneously weaving new conspiracies. He secretly made an alliance with the Scots, promising to establish Presbyterianism in England in exchange for military support. At the end of 1647, he escaped from his captivity on the Isle of Wight, from where he gave the signal for a new uprising. The outbreak of the Second Civil War in 1648 was a moment of terrible realization for Cromwell and his followers. They had tried to reach an agreement with Charles. They had offered him peace, and in response, he had plunged the country back into bloodshed. For these deeply religious men, this was not merely political betrayal. It was a sign from God. They no longer saw Charles as a misguided monarch, but as a man of blood, a tyrant who bore the guilt for all the shed blood, and with whom, according to the laws of the Old Testament, there could be no compromise. Their patience had run out. The war was short but brutal. While Fairfax suppressed the royalist uprising in the south of England, Cromwell marched north to confront the invading Scottish army. At the Battle of Preston, he completely annihilated the Scottish army in 3 days, despite being outnumbered 2-1, demonstrating brilliant tactics and strategy. The Second Civil War was won, and the army returned to London, filled with a cold, holy rage. They no longer wanted negotiations. They wanted a trial. But Parliament, even this meager remnant, still hesitated. The members feared taking the final, most terrible step, and so the army took matters into its own hands. On December 6, 1648, a regiment under the command of that same Colonel Pride surrounded the Parliament building and forcibly expelled all members who were willing to compromise with the king. This event went down in history as Pride's Purge. Of Parliament, only about 60 radical members remained, who unconditionally obeyed the army. This pitiful remnant established a special high court to try King Charles I Stuart, God's Anointed, for tyranny, treason, and the murder of his subjects. This was unheard of. Never before in history had subjects sat in judgment of their king. Charles himself, when brought into the courtroom, behaved with immense dignity. He refused to answer questions, declaring that no earthly court had power over him, as his authority came from God. Yet the trial proceeded. Cromwell, who may have initially hesitated, was now the driving force behind this court. He was convinced this was the will of God. He pressured the judges, threatened them, and forced them to sign the death warrant. On the 30th of January, 1649, on a cold winter morning, on the scaffold before the Palace of Whitehall, King Charles I of England was beheaded. Before his death, he gave a speech in which he forgave his enemies and put on 2 shirts so he would not shiver from the cold, lest the crowd think he was afraid. When the executioner held up the severed head, the crowd of many thousands in the square did not cry out in joy, but let out a single long groan, a groan of horror, shock, and perhaps remorse. Cromwell was there. Legend has it that he came that night to view the king's body. He looked long into the dead face and said, quote, "He was not a bloodthirsty madman. He likely believed to the very end that he was carrying out God's will and saving England." But by crossing this line, by executing God's anointed, he and his followers had burned all bridges behind them. There was no turning back. They had destroyed the old world, and now they had to build a new one on its ruins. The burden of this construction, as it turned out, would rest on the shoulders of one man, Oliver Cromwell, a modest farmer who unintentionally became the most powerful and most hated man in England. The king's execution did not bring peace to England. It sent the country into a state of shock and opened Pandora's box. Monarchical Europe was horrified by this unprecedented act of regicide. The English Republic, the Commonwealth as it was now called, became a pariah state. However, the greatest threats came not from without, but from within the fractured kingdom. In Scotland, the son of the executed monarch, the young Charles II, was immediately proclaimed king. And in Ireland, already a simmering cauldron of hatred for the English Protestant colonizers, a massive uprising erupted. The Irish Catholics joined forces with local royalists, raised an army, and effectively broke away from London's control. For the newborn republic, Ireland was a dagger at its throat. It could serve as a beachhead for an invasion by Charles II and his European allies. And Parliament decided to act. It resolved to send its best and most ruthless commander there. In August 1649, Oliver Cromwell landed in Dublin at the head of a 12,000-man expeditionary force. He did not travel to Ireland merely as a general sent to suppress a rebellion. In his own mind, he was the sword of the Lord, a new Joshua sent to punish sinners and idolaters. To him, as to most English Protestants of that era, Irish Catholics were not just enemies, they were savages, almost subhuman. The horrific stories, greatly exaggerated by propaganda, of the 1641 massacre of Protestant settlers in Ireland were vivid in his memory and in that of all England. He did not go there to negotiate. He went to exact revenge. His first strike was the siege of the town of Drogheda. A garrison consisting of 3,000 elite soldiers, mostly English royalists, refused to surrender. Cromwell, following the cruel laws of war of the time, ordered an assault. His Ironsides stormed the town after several fierce attacks, and then all hell broke loose. Cromwell gave the order to take no quarter. The soldiers of the garrison were slaughtered. Those who tried to seek refuge in churches were burned alive. All Catholic priests were also murdered. On Cromwell's orders, his soldiers carried out a massacre that did not spare parts of the civilian population. In his official report to Parliament, he wrote of it with an icy, almost religious satisfaction. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 1-8, underscore, underscore. He sincerely believed that cruelty was a form of mercy, that by making an example of terror, he would intimidate others into surrendering without a fight, thus saving lives. From Drogheda, he moved on to Wexford, and there the story repeated itself, but on an even more horrific scale. During negotiations for the town's surrender, his soldiers, whether by misunderstanding or by design, burst into the streets and unleashed an even more terrible slaughter. They killed approximately 2,000 soldiers and over 1,500 civilians, including women and children who drowned while trying to escape in boats. For the Irish, the name Cromwell became synonymous with the devil, a curse that lives on in their historical memory to this day. His 9-month campaign in Ireland was monstrously efficient. He broke the organized resistance, but the price was terrible. The military actions were followed by the confiscation of Catholic lands and their forced resettlement to the barren province of Connaught in the west of the island. To hell or to Connaught. That was the motto of this policy. Ireland was ruined. According to various estimates, up to 40% of the island's entire population perished from the war and the resulting famine and disease. For Cromwell, this was a victory of faith and civilization over barbarism and idolatry. For Ireland, it became a national catastrophe, the wounds of which have not healed to this day. He had scarcely finished the pacification of Ireland when he was urgently recalled to England. A new threat was emerging from the north. The young Charles II had made a pact with the Scottish Presbyterians. He agreed to adopt their faith in exchange for the crown and an army. Scotland, which had been an ally of the English Parliament just yesterday, had now become its enemy. The commander-in-chief of the new model army, Thomas Fairfax, already horrified by the king's execution, refused to lead the army against his former Scottish allies and resigned. Now there was no doubt who the sole and indispensable leader was. In June 1650, Oliver Cromwell was appointed Lord General, Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces. He immediately marched into Scotland, but here he faced a completely different adversary. The Scottish army, led by the experienced commander David Leslie, was disciplined and fanatical. Leslie, knowing he could not defeat Cromwell in open battle, employed scorched earth tactics. He retreated, luring the English army deep into the country while destroying all supplies. Cromwell's army, suffering from hunger and disease, was trapped near the town of Dunbar, pinned against the sea and surrounded by a Scottish force twice its size. The situation seemed hopeless. On the night before the battle, on the 3rd of September, 1650, a date Cromwell considered lucky, he prayed and sought a sign from God. And, as he himself believed, he received one. The Scots, overconfident and pressured by their preachers who demanded the immediate annihilation of the sectarian army, made a fatal mistake. They abandoned their advantageous positions on the hills and descended into the coastal plain to prepare for the morning's attack. Cromwell observed this maneuver and exclaimed, "The Lord hath delivered them into our hands." At dawn, in the pouring rain, he launched a sudden, devastating strike. His army, which the Scots had considered demoralized and broken, attacked the unprepared enemy like a single machine. The Battle of Dunbar became a classic of military art. The Scottish army was completely annihilated, 3,000 dead, 10,000 captured. Cromwell lost fewer than 30 men. This was not just a victory, it was a miracle, which Cromwell and his soldiers interpreted as direct proof of divine approval for their cause. But the war was not yet over. Exactly 1 year later, on the 3rd of September, 1651, Charles II and the remnants of the Scottish army made a desperate gamble. They invaded England, hoping to spark a royalist uprising. Cromwell caught up with them near the city of Worcester. This was his final great battle. He himself called it his crowning mercy. The royalist army was utterly crushed. Charles II escaped only by a miracle. According to legend, he hid for weeks in the hollow of an oak tree before finally fleeing to France. The war was over. All enemies of the Republic in England, Ireland, and Scotland had been defeated.